Good morning, and here is this week's food for thought. Recently, I've seen advertisements on looking into people's ancestry, looking to see about people's ancestors, and looking about where people come from and their history and their background. And that really intrigued me. And I was curious about my own ancestry and where I came from, and where my background and where my forefathers came from, and maybe even some of my makeup. And as my family and I this past week went to Bible study together, we sat in a community Bible study, and that became a subject in a conversation. Not about my history or background personally, or specifically of that of my family, but more or less that of my spiritual family, a background of that of my faith, and began to look and examine the faith and practices of that of a Christian. You see, our background comes from that of our Jewish roots, and our Jewish customs, and Jewish practices. Jesus Christ himself comes from a Jewish background. And we have been adopted into Judaism, not because we become Jews, but because we see the call of that first and foremost. Jesus was born into Judaism. Not that Jesus is a Jew, but the call of that of the laws of the Old Testament. Specifically, the call of that of the Sabbath, or shall we say the Shabbat. Now, when you look at that, the Shabbat was used as an opportunity, or shall we say the Sabbath, was used as an opportunity to devote oneself to a relationship and a time to God. What do we do with the Sabbath these days? How important is a Sabbath and taking a Sabbath? What value do we place on a Sabbath? How often do we take a Sabbath? What is the reason behind a Sabbath? You see, first and foremost, the reason behind a Sabbath, in the midst of the Ten Commandments, God made it clear in establishing his nation. In Exodus chapter 20, he said, "Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor, but on the seventh day you shall rest." Honoring that day in such a way, giving that day to God, a day that is called, a day that is there for sole purpose of spending that day with the Lord. How often do we dedicate a day where we are giving that day to God for the sole purpose of serving, worshiping, and living for God? And how often do we fill up our schedule that we don't allow ourselves to have time for God? That we give God just that little bit of time that may be there, instead of giving God an open schedule, where we give God the first opportunity, putting it there first, and allowing everything else fall around it. And we see that's not what God calls us to do. He says a Sabbath is expected. But that's the challenge. I find myself guilty in sometimes giving God my leftovers. Maybe it's just not even my time. How about with our treasure? Do we give God our Sabbath with our treasure? Do we look at our time with that of our tithe? How often do we give God and we look at our expenses and the money that we have? Do we set aside our tithe? And do we say we're going to put aside the 10% of what we have to give to God? And then with everything else, we'll spend. Or do we give God what we have left over after everything else has been spent? Do we give God our leftovers? And how about our talent? Do we take time to give God when everything else has been spent? You see, it's so important for us to stop and to recognize this day that we must be willing to give to God first. We must be willing to recognize and realize that God must be first in our life. We must be willing and to recognize that God must be our first love. And get back into the place where we need to be. I've been guilty. And it's time that we get back to our first love. Are you ready to get back to your first love? Are you ready to say, God, I'm ready to give back the time. I'm ready to take that Sabbath. I'm ready to put you in a priority, in a place where you belong, where you come first. And then, because I love you first, then I'm going to desire to spend that time, that Shabbat, to love others. Let's live for God, living for Jesus, and showing others how and why it's so important to love God. You ready to do it? Let's do it. Until next time.